There is one enemy in Diablo that is even more iconic than the titular villain, partly due to him requiring far less time to get to, but also due to his nightmare-inducing presentation. Whenever the Butcher is brought up online, like clockwork, someone will mention playing after dark, perhaps when they shouldn't have been, and strolling into a cursed room of twisted and deformed victims, blood staining the walls and floor, before them a demon with deadly intent, beelining for the player and bellowing his unforgettable fresh meat. It's no wonder that Farnham and Wirt are beyond traumatized from what they encountered here. Placed so early in the game, the Butcher was a deliberate trial by fire to test the player's skill and warn against opening doors so willy-nilly, as well as informally telling us that we do not need to complete every level before progressing. If a side quest area is too difficult, then keep grinding elsewhere and come back when you're more confident. Which isn't to say that beating the Butcher in a linear fashion at character level 6 or 7 is impossible. Any veteran can tell you that there's many strategies to beating this guy, from face tanking him with a ton of health potions to spamming firewalls to roast him alive. Some of the more exploity methods were even discovered during playtesting and purposefully kept in. Blizzard employees remember how Ullman discovered that the hero could kite the Butcher into following them onto geometry he couldn't navigate. As the Butcher is a murderous idiot, he's unable to open doors, a necessary character quirk that prevents him from leaving his own torture chamber too early. We can take advantage of this flaw, which I can only assume is a result of his fat hands being too unwieldy to grab the handles, by finding a grated wall bordered by a door. Placing oneself safely on the other side of the grate, we are free to fire any ranged attacks into the Butcher until he very slowly dies. A similar outcome can be achieved by taking him for a walk and trapping him in the U-shaped stairwell. It's fascinating to learn that certain exploits were deliberately left for players to discover. The strategies may break immersion, but with Blizzard's mantra of ease of access and fun coming first, their inclusion aligns perfectly. And it's not like the methods learned here will break the rest of the game. King Lyric, for example, has no problem with opening doors, nor will any grated walls help you against Zard the Mad. These are one-offs that reward lateral thinking, in a way honouring more hardcore gamers that approach the game with more experience than the otherwise newbie target audience. According to the Diablo fan wiki, the Butcher's quest was meant to be a bit more intricate. His chamber of unfortunate souls would be empty upon finding it. Returning to the surface would trigger new dialogue from the townsfolk. Wirt in particular will begin babbling in a strange backwards manner, mentioning a portal in the Butcher's room. The villagers are rightfully worried with Wirt's worsening condition, feeling for the boy's anguish from the loss of both his leg and mother.
That poor child was taken into the labyrinth by the demons, ripped from the very arms of his mother, Canis. May her soul rest in peace.
Gathering more information, Adria reveals that casting spells to create a passageway inside the Butcher's room may cause unexpected results. If we return to the chamber and cast a town portal, instead of a blue portal to Sanctuary, a crimson portal will appear instead. Stepping inside directs us to the Butcher's Chamber mini-dungeon, where the player must fight fallen ones and skeletons before eventually meeting the Butcher at the end. This alternate version of the quest is derived from the cut dialogue that was found on the disc via data mining. The footage in this video is grabbed from Beelzebub, which implements much of the game's cut content based on leftover code and interview accounts taken from David L. Craddock's book. The actual design of the Butcher's Chamber, however, is entirely fan-made. There is no early version of this layout anywhere from what I have found in my research. Speaking of research, the Diablo.fandom wiki, like many fandom wikis, cannot be trusted. If there isn't a source attributed to a line, don't trust the information. This Butcher paragraph is a prime example. It mentions that the quest and level were present in the earliest pre-release demo. It's not. For one, Kane isn't even in the demo. 2, the voice lines found on the retail disc are not used in the demo either, as the characters that do show up are using placeholder lines recorded by members of the Blizzard North team.
What do you seek?
And 3, the quest plays out as normal in the demo. The Butcher is chilling in his room, waiting for us to open it. Alongside the cut extended version of this boss battle was an additional cutscene still left on the game's CD. It's unclear where this video was meant to play. These videos in-game usually play when entering a new location, like with this one later in the game, so I would presume it is when you would teleport through the portal into the Butcher's dungeon. The Beelzebub mod places it a bit later as you open the door into the room he resides in itself. It's uncertain why the full boss battle was cut down to a single clash. We know it must have been longer based on the voice lines, even if a lot of the other information surrounding this content is fan-made. It was possibly for balancing reasons. The Butcher is hard enough as is, and this extended level would only have increased the difficulty. This coincides with Blizz North's stringent adherence to their in-house MON test. The side quests of Retail Diablo are all simple, requiring little extra thought beyond exploring the dungeon until you discover the item or monster you need to find. The Butcher's original quest idea, with the riddle from word and trial and error spellcasting, may have left the boss unvisited by many who didn't attempt to discover his hidden lair. For the Butcher's movie being cut, that's more likely due to the fact that it was rather low detail and looks pretty damn fake compared to the other CG videos. Perhaps this was an early render that never got improved upon, and with the quest being significantly truncated, there was no need for it to be remade. I mentioned the pre-release demo, specifically the demo released on magazine CDs in November of 1996, and also available to download from BBS's by the end of September. This demo was likely built in August of that year, 5 months before the final product hit shelves. Through the excellent archival prudence of Moritz Ernst Jacob and others online, we are fortunate to still have access to said demo, with the downloaded copy you're seeing here coming from Halifrey's unofficial Blizzard archive. This is the earliest known pre-release demo, and it was made available by Blizzard before the sign-up for the more well-known online-only Battle.net beta began, suggesting that the multiplayer component of the game was not in a testable state at this time, which, as we'll find, was very much the case. After the increased media attention from Blizz North's buyout, it was PC Gamer magazine that approached them about releasing a demo for Diablo. It was a mutually beneficial agreement. Blizzard got to advertise their new headline product, and PC Gamer could sell more copies to fans eager to try out this new offering from a company that already gained their trust with Warcraft. Brevik believed it to be a great opportunity to promote the game, but it was going to take extra work from the team. The largest amount of said extra work landed on their desks when none other than Microsoft came knocking on their door. DOS games were all the rage. If you were making a game for the PC, your number one call was DOS, with possible ports to Amiga and other platforms coming later. Microsoft were in the process of pulling users away from the command line and into their apparently user-friendly UI. Windows 98 had just superseded Windows 3.1, and it was growing at a decent rate, but still many gamers and developers preferred to stick to the familiarity of the DOS environment. Microsoft saw in Blizzard the opportunity to push gamers into installing Windows so that they could play the latest hits. Working with Windows itself didn't provide a huge benefit to the developers other than matching their new friendly design language. What was appealing, however, was DirectX. Through Microsoft's flagship multimedia API, Diablo could attain higher quality audio and visuals than the competition. Making the jump to being a Windows-only product kept the devs up at night, worrying that gamers would call them sellouts for turning their back on DOS, but the free advertising was enough to convince them. Microsoft were going to send out millions of Diablo demos across the world, and with a CD costing around $1 a press, Blizzard were getting literal millions of dollars worth of marketing to a global market with little investment from them, other than the time needed to develop and bug test the demo. Along with the placeholder voice acting, the demo is quite different from the release version. It has a more basic UI, clearly unfinalized character writing, attack RNG plays out for attacks against barrels, and worst of all, you had to spam click for everything, as there wasn't yet the option to hold down the left click button instead. Even the hold shift mechanic to stop the hero moving doesn't work unless you're using a bow. The biggest changes were with the game's interface and the difficulty. Spellcasting and item switching are quite clumsy. Scrolls, for example, cannot be used from the inventory, while potions can. They need to be chosen in the spell selector instead. The character and inventory menus are also flipped, and the quest log is hidden on the character screen rather than having its own button on the HUD. Not to mention the use of icons here. There's nothing wrong with icons, they're great for multilingual games, but you have to agree that they aren't as clear at first glance for the tech-illiterate audience they were aiming at. For the difficulty changes, it mostly comes down to balancing. Combat itself is similar to retail, if not a bit easier, with stun locking being far more powerful. It's the durability system that is unrelenting. Armor and weapons deteriorate in mere minutes of play, forcing the player to rely on the warrior's repair skill, or take the long journey back to the currently unnamed Griswold. With this in mind, I found myself juggling weapons far more than I ever did in vanilla, taking advantage of the on-the-fly inventory system to switch out my sword in the middle of a fight so as to prevent it from breaking. Diablo Evolution, an extensive fan wiki focused on Diablo's cut content and development, which is more trustworthy than the fandom wiki I may add, originally believed the pre-release demo to be closer in gameplay to the third alpha edition than the retail version due to these interface similarities. If you're interested in all of the changes Diablo had throughout its development, the fans here have created an excellent resource with a wealth of knowledge. The Alpha 3 version differed from retail not just with the archaic UI, but also in how the dungeons were generated, using an earlier version of the random generation code. Suggesting just how quickly the demo was put together, it didn't take long for the more inquisitive types to discover that by hex editing the demo's Diablo.exe file, they could unlock later levels in the game and the sorcerer class. As one would expect, it's an incredibly buggy result, more likely to crash than anything else, but for players in 1996, it was the best they had to satiate their Diablo hunger for the 3 months before a retail copy was available. If you get lucky with enemy spawns, meaning that the random enemies chosen for the level were actually contained in the files, then you could play all the way down to level 5 before the start of the catacomb levels. If you got unlucky, the demo would try to spawn an enemy type for which it had no graphics or sound, eventually ending with a crash to desktop. Even the Skeleton King quest is available from the Tristram cast, but the player can't enter his lair because, again, graphics for the king himself aren't included. With this additional side quest mostly intact, it's possible that the original demo was intended to be longer, and the area was cut to focus on releasing a structurally solid demo instead. What I find most interesting with breaking into this early version of the game is that we can gain an insight into Blizzard North's development process. The game existed as a breathing, working document that all members interacted with and updated. We can see that broken items have had a quick NW in brackets placed after them to indicate that they are not currently working. Most of these buggy items were fixed before release, yet some were kicked out of the game entirely, possibly because the enchantment made no sense or they couldn't get them to work in time. So popular was Diablo's pre-release demo that online publications like Dan Watt's PC RPG Group Therapy had devised a strategy for players struggling to beat the Butcher. We can see here that a proven method still mentioned today on Reddit forums and the like was discovered even before the game was released. Watts advises gamers to kill everything on the dungeon level to grind up a few levels and sell the resulting loot to buy a firewall spell to kill the Butcher with ease. Sites like these, despite being hard to find nowadays, are always a great insight into how gamers haven't really changed, as well as highlighting how prominent something as obscure as this pre-release demo actually was. Blizzard North gathered reams of helpful feedback from the demo, which they vigorously followed to drastically improve the game in the last months before release. Following the criticism for the interface, for example, the team chose to entirely overhaul it, creating the hotbar for the potions and scrolls in the process. Additional changes came in the form of extra content like new item graphics, overall balance changes, and including the rest of the game. The demo only contains the first level of the dungeon, similar to the free Shareware version containing the first 3. Shareware. It's hard not to wax lyrical about this lost form of advertisement, when companies were happy to rely on the strength of their game's first impressions to improve sales. Not that that always worked, of course, it's commonly understood, however never proven, that many people considered the shareware version of a game to be the complete version, or close enough at least. This leads to situations where many may believe they have completed Doom, for example, while they have only really experienced the first episode. To be fair to them though, except for higher level enemies and weapons, the shareware experience isn't far removed from the full product. Regardless, with 2-hour guaranteed refunds from Steam, this modern implementation isn't far removed from the reality of playing shareware, even if, for obvious reasons, it's lacking the nostalgia factor. Diablo's form of shareware allowed owners of the game to spawn a shareware copy onto other systems for playing without the Diablo CD. Spawn copies allowed multiplayer games using the warrior class, but the single player was limited only to the first 3 levels of the dungeon, so as to encourage sales of the game to those excited from their first impressions. As mentioned, unlike many RPGs, quests are merely a minor feature of Diablo. There exists a pool of 13 side quests in total, of which only 8 can exist in your game at any one time. An additional 3 quests are always a part of everyone's game, 2 of which could be better characterized as main quests, although the code and game itself makes no such distinction. For each group of quests, an arbitrary number of them is chosen upon hitting new game. As with many choices behind the randomization features, this too was to aid that all-encompassing goal of endless replayability. If you wish to, we can force all 13 random quests to spawn using a setting toggle in Devolution X. For a single complete playthrough, I believe this to be the best way to experience the game, unless of course you fully intend to replay it, in which case the random quest spawns will help keep the playthroughs varied. I should note that having all of the quests toggled on is rather unbalanced. It was never intended for the player to have access to every quest item so easily and early in their playthrough, instead attaining them all after 2 to 3 games. Inspired by Breivik's favourite roguelikes, side quests in Diablo work similarly to those, except in those primordials, they only existed in an informal sense. Angband, for example, doesn't have a quest log or characters that reveal items they want the hero to find. Instead, players could luck out and discover pre-made crypts on the various dungeon levels, a static place of interest slotted into the game's randomly generated labyrinth. Entering one of these crypts presented a risk-reward scenario. The monsters within were some of the deadliest in the game, but the static treasures they dropped were often more powerful than the random affairs found elsewhere. This design philosophy is paid homage to in Diablo, with quests like the Curse of King Lyric, Poisoned Water and the Chamber of Bone, all using predetermined levels placed within the grander randomized one. Before being acquired by Davidson and Associates, Condor's initial builds of Diablo were bare of any significant story. That only came later when Blizzard joined in on the development, sending over designer Chris Metzen to write a solid narrative and lore for the early IP, working alongside Eric Schaefer. Before Metzen's involvement, Schaefer admits that the side quests just fell into the game design as they worked on the project. If a level began to feel stale, they'd throw in a new quest or boss to spice up the gameplay and give players a goal. Schaefer all but confirmed that by this point much of the game was created using this organic process. The original design document had been surpassed and they were developing on feel rather than sticking to a predetermined plan. The problem with this method, however, is that it wasn't long until they realized they didn't have anywhere near enough quests to keep replay value high. To write this, Schaefer put out a bounty. For every good quest a developer wrote that ended up in the game, they would get a reward of $5. Artist Eric Sexton answered the call for arms, writing around 30 quests and by his own account, writing most of the ones that ended up in the game. Estimating from Schaefer and Sexton's account, we can assume that the quests Sexton added were those not necessarily tied to additional dungeon areas, as these pre-built locations were added organically when they were felt necessary. It was instead the fetch quests that see the player locating a certain item for a town member that can likely be attributed to Sexton. These fetch quests aren't winning any rewards, they're basic as any RPG fetch quest can be, but for $5 a pop, they fit the bill of a simple means for rewarding players who aim towards completionism as their hero aids the people of Tristram. The mechanics of the quests, what little there are, may not be of note, yet the excellent lore surrounding them certainly is. From the grander King Leoric boss battle to fetch quests like the Anvil of Fury, it was all realised by Metzen. Having conceptualized much of the background storylines found in the manuals of Warcraft, it wasn't by chance that Blizzard South had selected him to give Diablo the narrative it needed to terrify and enamor its audience. He was assigned to take what Blizzard North had started and devise myths and legends to give it a breathing world to live within. He took all of the quests, wrote backstories, rejigged them if necessary, and wrapped an overarching plot around them. As Sexton recalls, Metzen didn't change the quests so much as he took all these unconnected story ideas and events and wrapped them up into one idea. Indeed, the lore within the manual is an antithesis to Diablo's simplicity. What little story exists in-game is not only supplemented by, but is stood on top of the shoulders of the core of fiction presented within. This was by intention, with Metzen's ambition being to create a big, classical, mythical backdrop to bolster the otherwise rather vague writings in-game. It's basically a catchphrase for this retrospective. Again, this is all down to the MOM test. The story and quest as presented are basic by design. The manual gives all the exposition and knowledge needed, and even if you don't read it, the name and box cover should be doing the heavy lifting for you on this one. It isn't hard to work out what your goal should be. An aside to this MOM test is how one discovers some of the quests, as a few are started by talking to your neighbours in town, but there isn't any indicator to tell you when they have one, unlike Diablo 2 for example. When a villager has a quest, merely walking up to them and starting the conversation will get it rolling, and to be honest, as it's usually the utility-based townsfolk that give quests, it's nigh on impossible to miss one. They'll bombard you with their request as soon as you try to get healed or sell some loot. The side quests, as watered down as they are in comparison to most other CRPGs, are only ancillary to the original objective of Diablo's ASCII inspirations. For all this extra content, the game doesn't deviate from the goal of going down the dungeon and beating the big bad at the bottom. Their unimportant status doesn't free them from criticism. Additional choice and consequences tied to these side quests would have been nice. Many of them don't even have a conclusion. For example, killing the butcher warrants no response from the townsfolk, and there is no means of telling Farnham nor Wirt that the monster of their nightmares is gone. Generally, the lack of any consequences to your good deeds inhibits any meaningful building of relationships with the townsfolk. Their purpose remains utilitarian, and so is the reason to complete the side quests. You won't be doing it for the purpose of role-playing, but instead in pursuit of the sick unique loot you'll receive in return. It all boils down to Diablo being aware of what it is, an action game where you smack demons hoping for magical goodies to fall from their crimson remains. Gameplay comes first, but I can't disagree with any complaints about the lack of role-playing in a game that claims to be in the RPG genre. Indeed, this is why the distinction between ARPGs and CRPGs is made to this day. Diablo clones are almost expected to have subpar side quests, with many fans of the genre skipping the lore text so they can mindlessly follow the quest log as it asks them to kill 12 bow-legged frogs or whatever arbitrary task the designer pulled from a hat. In some regards, this is patient zero of that philosophy. A few lines thrown in on the ending cutscene would have been appreciated, a la Fallout, recounting how our efforts changed the world, what good occurs if we defeat the Butcher, or what evil continues if we do not, what happens to Tristram if we don't cleanse the well's water source, and so on. Then again, none of it matters to the overarching storyline, and admittedly may have hindered storytelling in the sequels. One can argue what purpose there would even be in helping these people knowing what happens to them. Fallout is still praised for its choice and consequences though, even with the sequel forcing an outcome only a select number of players had. Just a little acknowledgement would have gone a long way. Some of the most curious cut content for Diablo exists in the form of its many lost side quests. Researching through all of the content that was yanked from the game before release, it's hard not to notice just how much was left out, mostly due to time constraints. From fascinating quests, hidden features, and a heap of gameplay systems that never made it into the final product, until they would return in the sequel. Even though Diablo is a great game, this content highlights how it wasn't as good as it may have been, or perhaps as it should have been. Assorted documents donated by members of Diablo's development team to Craddock outlined some of these unused ideas, starting with the abandoned mines, where upon entering the second level of the caves, a special event would trigger in Tristram. With the cave entrance revealed in the mountains to the west of town, the denizens of the caves would have spilled out onto the surface. When the hero returned, they would have to fight off a horde of monsters while the inhabitants cowered inside their homes. After killing the final invader, the townsfolk would re-emerge to tell the player that they must stop the enemy from using the new passageway. From there, we would have had to cast a cut earthquake spell to destroy the cave entrance and save the town. This would have been the first time we saw enemies on the overworld, years before Diablo 2, which would have heightened that unease Tristram's atmosphere exudes. At any moment, your bastion from combat could become another gauntlet to overcome. Understandably, that was the reason for why it was cut. If a player had used a town portal to get out of a sticky situation in hopes of replenishing their health and potions, only to then find the town overrun and Pepin unreachable, they could have soft-locked their game. Without multiple save files, the player may have had to even start a new game to escape this nightmare, a guaranteed way of alienating them. Not to mention that certain character builds would not have been able to cast the Earthquake spell without speccing into magic, ensuring that their playthrough would have been marred by a constant invasion. It was an exciting concept, but in execution it would have required extensive reworking so as to not harm the experience. Another quest would even open up a second dungeon unattached to the cathedral, a feature brought forward from the original design document that wouldn't be implemented in-game until the official Hellfire expansion a year later. Dubbed the Lair of Worms, it was started by Pepin. In the basement of one of his patients, he discovered a sickly sweet smell rising from a cellar door. Entering the house next to Farnham, we find ourselves in a cave system surrounded on all sides by huge worms. By defeating them and returning to the healer, he would congratulate us on our victory. No quest reward is mentioned within the leftover voice lines, so it's possible that whatever it was could be found on a boss mob within the cave system. There isn't really a good reason for the cutting of this one. The cave tile set could have been used and the worm mob was already animated. We'll have to pot it up to time constraints in the crunch period. My personal favourite of the cut content is the description of the Village of Lost Souls. This quest would have seen players entering an underground city within the catacombs, likely separated at its own level like the Chamber of Bone. The secreted away city would at first appear normal as a subterranean town can be. Soon though, the inhabitants would reveal themselves to be demons in disguise, as the quest turns into another mini dungeon to clear. The hero would have been made privy to the hidden stairwell to this dungeon from a passing stranger in Tristram, who claims to have hailed from the lost city. Despite this quest not appearing to be any more intricate than King Leoric's tomb, bar the disguised inhabitants, I find the notion of the demons using deceit to try and trick the player into a death trap to be a fascinating take from the monsters that we hadn't seen in Diablo 1. Most of the enemies don't appear to be very intelligent at all, so this quest would have really helped to indicate to us that they do have the aptitude to defend themselves past brute force. Why this one was cut could have been down to a number of reasons. Designing the city for one would require art they didn't have time to make, unless the plan was to place the Tristram-style domiciles within the Catacombs tile set. They would have had to design additional character art too for the disguised demons. If they had just recycled the residents of Tristram, the trickery wouldn't have worked on the player. There's also that stranger in town to consider. It's only in these cut quests where demons are able to penetrate Tristram. It's alluded to that the Fallen One imps stole Ogden's sign, but it's also made clear that they could only do this at night, as they are weak to sunlight. The stranger would work against this law, and require an explanation for their immunity to daytime's effects. Although this likely could have been explained by the constant dusk Tristram has found itself veiled in. Either way, with so little of this quest existing in code, it was likely cut earlier than some of the others, such as Jwlar, the Fallen Angel. Not only did this quest later become a defining part of Diablo 2's main story, but it had fully recorded voice lines, written lore that wasn't removed from the manual, and specific pieces of art designed for it. As per the manual, Jwlar was lieutenant to the Archangel Tyrael, wielder of the mighty Azurath sword. He led a fierce attack upon the Hellforge to prevent the creation of the dark demon blade Shadowfang. In his quest to destroy both the weapon and its creator, Jwlar was overcome by the legions of chaos and lost to the darkness, turning against his allegiances. Thrown into a pit in the levels of hell, he was transformed into an abomination where he will engage the hero on their path down to Diablo, similar to the Blood Knight we find in the retail copy. Jwlar has his own sound file.
How much suffering, mortal, does it take before you lose your grace? Let me show you.
And the graphic for his blade Azurath is still left on the disc. The voice line makes it clear that we would have battled Jwlar, but past that we know little. Perhaps there was to be an additional dungeon for him to preside over. The Hellforge he was sent to destroy would have worked nicely. With the art for Azurath, we can conclude that the quest reward could have been this holy weapon, but past its appearances, we have no idea what enchantments it may have had. There are some theories that the Jwlar quest could have been tied into another, a fetch quest to find the Shadowfang weapon from Jwlar's lore snippet. In Tristram, there was meant to be an additional cast member, a priest named Tremaine. We don't know where he would have been found, possibly by the cathedral exterior itself, tending to the butcher's victim. Beelzebub's restored content places him by one of the houses east of the inn. Tremaine would have guided us in the last few missions, only to have been killed by a cursed sword. We can quite confidently determine that the character was cut fairly early on due to his incomplete set of dialogue that doesn't include any gossip about the other townsfolk. Having said that though, the other townsfolk do have gossip for him, so perhaps he wasn't cut as early as some sources believe. My theory is that Tremaine was an early version of Cain that was replaced once the competition had been run to change the character's name. From there, the Deckard Cain character grew and enveloped the priest. My evidence for this is that Tremaine was originally intended to be the last of an ancient order in one of the cut quests associated with him, much akin to Cain and the Haradrim. But then again, Cain has cut dialogue referencing this very scenario of the two ancient orders, so it could just be a coincidence. The Shadowfang quest, in some regards, appears to have been the original main quest, given to the player by Tremaine at the beginning of the game before the hero had entered the dungeon. We hear in his cut voice line,
I have had a most disturbing experience that I must share with you, my friend. I was called upon to help one of the men that escaped from the labyrinth. I suspected that he was possessed by some sort of demonic entity, and so began to drive the evil from within him. After many hours, I was able to exorcise a demon who called himself Fleshdoom. I believe that the labyrinth has somehow become a gateway to the underworld. The man who was possessed retained memories of an ancient demon blade named Shadowfang. If you find the demon Fleshdoom, beware this foul sword. Bring the sword to me and I can destroy it. Do not wield it, for its power can corrupt absolutely.
Very little is known about this Fleshdoom. Some sources online speculate that Fleshdoom may not have even wielded the blade, as Tremaine will congratulate the player on killing him, but still send us to find Shadowfang.
Shadowfang remains. It must be found and destroyed.
I believe this instead to be a line that would trigger if the player failed to pick up the item that the boss dropped. Without text boxes to highlight items in the vanilla game, it's more than likely that some would miss it on the floor. No other information on Fleshdoom exists on the disc, so sadly we can only speculate on what he looked like and where he would have been placed. Once Shadowfang is found, we hit a twist. Once given to Tremaine, the blade consumes him in fire, giving us his final instructions as he burns.
Oh, it burns! Hellfire consuming me!
We're tasked with taking the blade back to the Hellforge from which it came. It was possibly here where the hero had to face off against Jwlar, the defender of the Hellforge. Two elements of this quest were repackaged in Diablo 2, the weapon Shadowfang and the Hellforge location, which the player must visit to destroy Mephisto's Soulstone. Its presence in Diablo 1, however, creates an in-game paradox. As the Hellforge almost certainly would have been found before Lazarus, it was possible for Tremaine to die before he was meant to provide dialogue for starting the Lazarus quest. This may have been why said quest was given to Cain instead, or it's possibly that the game would have randomly decided between the Shadowfang quest or the Lazarus one, similar to how most other quests are randomly spawned. Having a randomized main quest like this would have upped the replay value just that little bit more. I can only imagine how cool the schoolyard conversations would have been if people had fought two entirely different endgame bosses before facing Diablo himself. Tremaine's quest reward for destroying Lazarus was the unique mace Lightforge. This weapon exists in full on the disc, enchantment and all. Although with no way to obtain it legitimately, many players liked to brandish it on Battle.net, having used third-party programs to hack the item into their inventory. The last remnant of a character that could have been as much a staple to the series as Deckard Cain or Adria the Witch, relegated to novelty piece of loot. Continuing the theme of content returning in the sequel, even Andariel was meant to appear. Also placed outside of the dungeon, Andariel's quest was to take place in a darkened forest near Tristram. Somewhat related to this, in the pre-release demo, there exists a road and bridge northeast of the stone wall near to the cows, which was taken out for the retail release. Was this used at some point to reach the forest perhaps? This quest is notable for being one of the only times that Jillian is involved. Andariel, the Maiden of Anguish, has been killing the men of the town, and if we do not act fast, she fears that Ogden and Pepin may be next. Entering the forest, the job at hand is to find and defeat the powerful succubus. It isn't clear how we would reach the forest, whether from the town itself or from within the dungeon, but it's likely that its location is the reason for it being cut. With time constraints already cutting the dungeon down from 20 to 16 levels, there was no time to create a whole new forest biome, as well as the sense of urgency implied by Jillian never having any follow through. I doubt they would have had men like Ogden, and especially not Pepin, Cain or Griswold, disappear if the player does not complete the quest, resulting in the world feeling even more static. It comes back to the lack of choice and consequences. As interesting as this quest may have been, it actually strengthens Diablo to forego any quests that further highlight its simplicity. The Map of the Stars quest is the most controversial one. It's by far the most developed of the cut quests, coming with a cutscene, item art and all the expected voice lines. It's also one of the few pieces of cut content that can definitely be placed on developer choice rather than lack of time. Playtesting found that the quest changed how players approached the endgame in a way they thought weakened the experience. Supposedly one of the last in the game, it's the only quest the player could actually fail. As the hero entered hell, they would find a mysterious map depicting the sky and stars, which would trigger the start of a countdown. The map was a timer, specifically one to defeat Diablo before the stars aligned. If the player failed to do so, the Lord of Terror would attain his full might and become all but invincible, to the point where one may never have a chance to rid the world of his evil ever again. While he wouldn't actually be unkillable, he would have immunity to all magic and full resistances across the board, forcing any build to try and whittle him down using melee or stone golem spells. This tedium would have ruined the ending for many. An example of how annoying this would be can be seen in the Hellfire expansion. Narcruel, the end boss of that content, would have the same invulnerability unless the hero opened his chamber by reading spellbooks in a specific sequence. Even with an overly leveled build on normal difficulty, I could barely dent the fiend. This is the only removed quest that was ever officially recognized by Blizzard, with Brevik mentioning that it was left out because it changed the way you played Diablo. Sexton was its originator. He cleared up how, in the end, we decided racing against a time limit isn't fun, so we yanked the quest. It wasn't until Diablo 2 that Blizzard North realized that rushing through the game had its own kind of fun. For Diablo, they were still latching on to the slow-paced methodology of its previous life as a turn-based game. Deliberate, plodding gameplay that kept tensions high rather than speeding through for the best completion time possible. The Map of Stars worked against their slower design philosophy, even if it ironically would have worked perfectly for the sequel. Funnily enough, Hellfire took advantage of these cut voice lines for their own quests. The developers of the expansion were unable to get the original voice actors back, so they forced their quest writing around what was left on Diablo's disc in a weak attempt of utilizing the existing town cast. There's a myriad of smaller cut quests too, closer in design to minor tasks. A bunch of unused voice lines allude to these, ranging from basic fetch quests to more elaborate multi-stage treasure hunts. The items desired by the characters isn't explicitly stated, which has led some to theorize that they may have been similar in concept to Daggerfall's procedurally generated quests, where the required item could be chosen from a list at random. For example, Griswold could ask you to find a sword to study, then the quest log dialogue may have been updated to show which kind of sword you had to go find. Similar to modern Bethesda's Radiant Quest system, while this would have aligned perfectly with the goal of endless replayability and no two games being the same, as we've seen with the Radiant Quest systems, they are transparent and not worth the effort. If the reward was great enough to be worth the banality, the game balance could have been broken as a result. It's for the best that such a system was never implemented, but I can't help but imagine how it alludes to a bigger Diablo than the one we got, with more CRPG elements being pulled from the competition, along with walking NPCs and even the manual referring to Tristram as a city rather than the dilapidated hamlet we ended up with. At one point, Blizzard North were aiming for a vaster experience than they streamlined down to. Hindsight is great, however, and we know from more objective factors such as sale numbers and congregate review scores across critics and fans that Diablo is adored as it is, and I don't think an increase of content would have necessarily helped the game, instead sincerely harming it, as it did those early Elder Scrolls entries and more recently Starfield, too big for their own sake. The final cut quest has Farnham not just relegated to window dressing, but with an adventure of his own to find some kind of island of the Sunless Sea. This is one of the least developed of the cut quests. We have voice lines, but nothing else. Piecing together the puzzle, it seems that the hero had to have found a trinity of magical rocks in the dungeon that would then teleport them to the staging area for the Sin War. Given how grandiose this premise sounds, it's unsurprising that it was cut, given the game's crunch period. And what a crunch period it was. Crunch is an accepted fact of game development. It shouldn't be, but racing the past to finish with the aim of releasing a product you can be proud of, or in at least an acceptable state, is an unfortunate standard in many industries. Staying all hours and sleeping beneath a desk is an all too common story emanating from the offices of overworked, passionate developers. And Blizzard North was no different in this regard. Having missed a November release date, the game didn't hit shelves until the very last day of 1996 in Cis Brevik. But even then, that was only in their home state of California. A worldwide release sat in the barren January and February period. Admittedly, dubious sources placed the blame for the delay on the Battle.net implementation. While there is some truth to that, in reality, everyone at Blizzard North worked right up until the game went gold. It was a perfect storm. Many of the developers had never released a PC game before. Lead programmer Brevik had never written a game in C before this, previously working in assembly. There were AI bugs galore. The final hell levels hadn't even entered production until the summertime, less than 6 months before release. Content hadn't been completed, and Battle.net had only been a pipe dream for much of the game's development. It wasn't just Blizzard North pushing it to the limit either. Pat Wyatt revealed that while it was Blizzard North that got the credit for Diablo, literally every single employee at Blizzard worked on it. They were supposed to be working on StarCraft, but as Diablo's tentative release date came and went, over time everyone got pulled off to supplement Blizzard North, from the art team, designers, tech team, and the programmers. At one point there was only a single programmer left chipping away on StarCraft, the lead programmer. And in time, even he was pulled off the project to finish the installer for Diablo, as the other programmers dived into the Battle.net code. Blizzard knew they were up against the wall, refusing to give any official release date to any outlets, and just saying before Christmas. Admirably, they even refused to accept any pre-orders, which on one hand shows a love for their customer base, and on the other displays a level of fear about the quality of Diablo. Brevik seems to look back at the time quite fondly. He elaborates about how psyched he was to be working on his dream project for the platform he wanted and with the funding he needed. Living the dream, yet he was working ridiculous hours. His brother, who also worked as a programmer at Blizz North, recalls Brevik picking him up in the morning around 5 AM, working all day before heading home around 6 PM for a quick dinner, only to then continue working at the kitchen table on a computer he had specifically set up there for the crunch period. They would work an additional 5 to 6 hours until heading to bed at 2 AM for 3 hours of sleep max, just to wake up to do it all over again. All of this while Brevik's wife was pregnant with a baby due in late December 1996. On December 10th, his wife called him with contractions. He recalled how they desperately wanted to get the game out before Christmas, but it just wasn't ready, and here was his worst case scenario. Being a father came first, and a birth would inevitably delay Diablo even further. To his surprise, it was a false alarm, and Brevik's daughter was born on the 3rd of January 1997, barely a week after the game went gold. As Brevik says, "She waited for me to finish." It was a grueling process, but everyone in the office was committed. Those early days of Quake tournaments, daytime gaming and casually working had come to bite them in the arse. Hygiene standards quickly slipped. Office manager and lovingly dubbed Den Mom Karen Colenso noticed that the office had become pretty smelly. She remembers getting kits of toothpaste, toothbrushes and deodorant for everyone as they grinded towards completion. The team recalls a sense of camaraderie from the experience. Rick says at one point had been coding away for more than 72 hours and was falling asleep at his desk until Brevik stepped in to send him to bed and complete the task himself. They were in the trenches together, putting in the necessary work to create a product they could confidently place on store shelves. Being tied to Blizzard was the best possibility the Diablo team could hope for. Michael Morhaime conveyed how to them, the iterative polish phase sets their games apart and makes them magical, with the final 10% of polish being the difference between a good and a great game. Most developers would agree with Morhaime's sentiments, but as we know, problems often arise for developers beholden to a publisher targeting its quarterly projections, forcing incomplete products out of the door to make a quick buck. 90s Blizzard preferred to miss release dates to release a polished game, allowing them to avoid the vicious cycle that far too often destroys a game's full potential. Even with the help of Blizzard's South Strike team, they missed the prime Christmas shopping season they had all been hoping for, yet the timing of its release didn't seem to impact sales very much. Fortunately for all, before long, Diablo was another multi-million seller for Blizzard. They had only aimed to sell 20,000 copies, enough to warrant investing into a sequel. They blew that number out of the water, peaking as the best-selling RPG in January and soon topping the total PC game sales month after month through 1997. By June, over 700,000 people had played Diablo online, with estimated sales figures in the 20 million range just for the first year. Surpassing your sales goal by over 1,000 times isn't half bad. If it wasn't for the pop culture dynamite that was missed, it would have been the best-selling PC game for the entire year. Pretty good for an RPG that the publisher's Brevik once approached claimed wouldn't sell.